Chapter 5. A negotiation by delaying, he restored the state. Ennius, answer me without lies, if you can, you damned dog. How did you get to know Madame de Renal? When did you speak to her? I have never spoken to her, answered Julien. I have only seen that lady in church. You must have looked at her, you impudent rascal. Not once. You know, I only see God in church, answered Julien, with a little hypocritical air, well suited, so he thought, to keep off the parental clause. Nonetheless, there's something that does not meet the eye, answered the cunning peasant. He was then silent for a moment. But I shall never get anything out of you, you damned hypocrite, he went on. As a matter of fact, I am going to get rid of you, and my sawmill will go all the better for it. You have nobbled the curate or somebody else who has got you a good place. Run along and pack your traps, and I will take you to M. de Renal's, where you are going to be tutor to his children. What shall I get for that? Board, clothing, and 300 francs salary. I do not want to be a servant. Who's talking of being a servant, you brute? Do you think I want my son to be a servant? But with whom shall I have my meals? This question discomforted old Sorrel, who felt he might possibly commit some imprudence if he went on talking. He burst out against Julien, flung insult after insult at him, accused him of gluttony, and left him to go and consult his other sons. Julien saw them afterwards, each one leaning on his axe and holding counsel. Having looked at them for a long time, Julien saw that he could find out nothing, and went and stationed himself on the other side of the saw in order to avoid being surprised. He wanted to think over this unexpected piece of news, which changed his whole life, but he felt himself unable to consider the matter prudently, his imagination being concentrated in wondering what he would see in M. de Renal's fine mansion. I must give all that up, he said to himself, rather than let myself be reduced to eating with the servants. My father would like to force me to it. I would rather die. I have 15 francs, and 8 sous of savings. I will run away tonight. I will go across country by paths where there are no gendarmes to be feared, and in 2 days I shall be at Besançon. I will enlist as a soldier there, and, if necessary, I will cross into Switzerland. But in that case, no more advancement. It will be all up with my being a priest, that fine career which may lead to anything. This abhorrence of eating with the servants was not really natural to Julien. He would have done things quite, if not more, disagreeable in order to get on. He derived this repugnance from the Confessions of Rousseau. It was the only book by whose help his imagination endeavored to construct the world. The collection of the bulletins of the Grand Army and the memorial of St. Helena completed his Koran. He would have died for these 3 works. He never believed in any other. To use a phrase of the old Surgeon Major, he regarded all the other books in the world as packs of lies, written by rogues in order to get on. Julien possessed both a fiery soul and one of those astonishing memories which are so often combined with stupidity, in order to win over the old Cure Julien, on whose good grace he realized that his future prospects depended. He had learnt by heart the New Testament in Latin. He also knew M. de Maistre book on the Pope, and believed in one as little as he did in the other. Sorel and his son avoided talking to each other today, as though by mutual consent. In the evening Julien went to take his theology lesson at the cure's, but he did not consider that it was prudent to say anything to him about the strange proposal which had been made to his father. It is possibly a trap, he said to himself. I must pretend that I have forgotten all about it. Early next morning, M. de Renal had old Sorel summoned to him. He eventually arrived, after keeping M. de Renal waiting for an hour and a half, and made, as he entered the room, 100 apologies interspersed with as many bows. After having run the gauntlet of all kinds of objections, Sorel was given to understand that his son would have his meals with the master and mistress of the house, and that he would eat alone in a room with the children on the days when they had company. The more clearly Sorel realized the genuine eagerness of M. the mayor, the more difficulties he felt inclined to raise. Being moreover full of mistrust and astonishment, he asked to see the room where his son would sleep. It was a big room, quite decently furnished, into which the servants were already engaged in carrying the beds of the 3 children. This circumstance explained a lot to the old peasant. He asked immediately, with quite an air of assurance, to see the suit which would be given to his son.
M.
De Rênal opened his desk and took out 100 francs. Your son will go to M. Durand, the draper, with this money, and will get a complete black suit. And even supposing I take him away from you, said the peasant, who had suddenly forgotten all his respectful formalities, will he still keep this black suit? Certainly. Well, said Sorel, in a drawling voice, all that remains to do is to agree on just one thing, the money which you will give him. What? Exclaimed M. de Rênal indignantly. We agreed on that yesterday. I shall give him 300 francs. I think that is a lot and probably too much. That is your offer, and I do not deny it, said old Sorel, speaking still very slowly, and by a stroke of genius which will only astonish those who do not know the Franche-Comté peasants, he fixed his eyes on M. de Rênal and added, We shall get better terms elsewhere. The mayor's face exhibited the utmost consternation at these words. He pulled himself together, however, and after a cunning conversation of 2 hours' length, where every single word on both sides was carefully weighed, the subtlety of the peasant scored a victory over the subtlety of the rich man, whose livelihood was not so dependent on his faculty of cunning. All the numerous stipulations which were to regulate Julien's new existence were duly formulated. Not only was his salary fixed at 400 francs, but they were to be paid in advance on the 1st of each month. Very well, I will give him 35 francs, said M. de Rênal. I am quite sure, said the peasant in a fawning voice, that a rich, generous man like the mayor would go as far as 36 francs to make up a good round sum. Agreed, said M. de Rênal. But let this be final. For the moment his temper gave him a tone of genuine firmness. The peasant saw that it would not do to go any further. Then, on his side, M. de Rênal managed to score. He absolutely refused to give old Sorel, who was very anxious to receive it on behalf of his son, the 36 francs for the first month. It had occurred to M. de Rênal that he would have to tell his wife the figure which he had cut throughout these negotiations. Hand me back the 100 francs which I gave you, he said sharply. Durand owes me something. I will go with your son to see about a black cloth suit. After this manifestation of firmness, Sorel had the prudence to return to his respectful formulas. They took a good quarter of an hour. Finally, seeing that there was nothing more to be gained, he took his leave. He finished his last bow with these words, I will send my son to the chateau. The mayor's officials called his house by this designation when they wanted to humor him. When he got back to his workshop, it was in vain that Sorel sought his son. Suspicious of what might happen, Julien had gone out in the middle of the night. He wished to place his cross of the Legion of Honor and his books in a place of safety. He had taken everything to a young wood merchant named Fouque, who was a friend of his, and who lived in the high mountain which commands Verrières. God knows, you damned lazy bones, said his father to him when he reappeared, if you will ever be sufficiently honorable to pay me back the price of your board which I have been advancing to you for so many years. Take your rags and clear out to M. the mayor's. Julien was astonished at not being beaten and hastened to leave. He had scarcely got out of sight of his terrible father when he slackened his pace. He considered that it would assist the rôle played by his hypocrisy to go and say a prayer in the church. The word hypocrisy surprises you? The soul of the peasant had had to go through a great deal before arriving at this horrible word. Julien had seen in the days of his early childhood certain dragoons of the 6th with long white cloaks and hats covered with long black-plumed helmets who were returning from Italy, and tied up their horses to the grilled window of his father's house. The sight had made him mad on the military profession. Later on he had listened with ecstasy to the narrations of the battles of Lodi, Arcola, and Rivoli, with which the old surgeon major had regaled him. He observed the ardent gaze which the old man used to direct towards his cross, but when Julien was 14 years of age they commenced to build a church at Verrières which, in view of the smallness of the town, has some claim to be called magnificent. There were 4 marble columns in particular, the sight of which impressed Julien. They became celebrated in the district owing to the mortal hate which they raised between the justice of the peace and the young vicar who had been sent from Besançon and who passed for a spy of the congregation. The justice of the peace was on the point of losing his place, so said the public opinion, at any rate. Had he not dared to have a difference with the priest who went every fortnight to Besançon, where he saw, so they said, my lord the bishop, Meanwhile the justice of the peace, who was the father of a numerous family, gave several sentences which seemed unjust. All these sentences were inflicted on those of the inhabitants who read the Constitutional. The right party triumphed. It is true it was only a question of sums of 3 or 5 francs, but one of these little fines had to be paid by a nail-maker, who was godfather to Julien. This man exclaimed in his anger, "What a change! And to think that for more than 20 years the justice of the peace has passed for an honest man." The surgeon major, Julien's friend, died. Suddenly Julien left off talking about Napoleon. He announced his intention of becoming a priest, and was always to be seen in his father's workshop occupied in learning by heart the Latin Bible which the cure had lent him. The good old man was astonished at his progress, and passed whole evenings in teaching him theology. In his society Julien did not manifest other than pious sentiments. Who could not possibly guess that beneath this girlish face, so pale and so sweet, lurked the unbreakable resolution to risk 1,000 deaths rather than fail to make his fortune. Making his fortune primarily meant to Julien getting out of Verrières. He abhorred his native country. Everything that he saw there froze his imagination. He had had moments of exultation since his earliest childhood. He would then dream with gusto of being presented one day to the pretty women of Paris. He would manage to attract their attention by some dazzling feat. Why should he not be loved by one of them just as Bonaparte, when still poor, had been loved by the brilliant Madame de Beauharnais? For many years past Julien had scarcely passed a single year of his life without reminding himself that Bonaparte, the obscure and penniless lieutenant, had made himself master of the whole world by the power of his sword. This idea consoled him for his misfortune, which he considered to be great, and rendered such joyful moments as he had doubly intense. The building of the church and the sentences pronounced by the justice of the peace suddenly enlightened him. An idea came to him which made him almost mad for some weeks, and finally took complete possession of him with all the magic that a first idea possesses for a passionate soul which believes that it is original. At the time when Bonaparte got himself talked about, France was frightened of being invaded. Military distinction was necessary and fashionable. Nowadays, one sees priests of 40 with salaries of 100,000 francs, that is to say, 3 times as much as Napoleon's famous generals of a division. They need persons to assist them. Look at that justice of the peace, such a good sort, and such an honest man up to the present, and so old too. He sacrifices his honor through the fear of incurring the displeasure of a young vicar of 30. I must be a priest. On one occasion, in the middle of his newfound piety, he had already been studying theology for 2 years. He was betrayed by a sudden burst of fire which consumed his soul. It was at Julien's. The good cure had invited him to a dinner of priests, and he actually let himself praise Napoleon with enthusiasm. He bound his right arm over his breast, pretending that he had dislocated it in moving a trunk of a pine tree, and carried it for 2 months in that painful position. After this painful penance, he forgave himself. This is the young man of 18 with a puny physique, and scarcely looking more than 17 at the outside, who entered the magnificent church of Verrières carrying a little parcel under his arm. He found it gloomy and deserted. All the transepts in the building had been covered with crimson cloth in celebration of a feast. The result was that the sun's rays produced an effect of dazzling light of the most impressive and religious character. Julien shuddered. Finding himself alone in the church, he established himself in the pew, which had the most magnificent appearance. It bore the arms of M. d'Argenal. Julien noticed a piece of printed paper spread out on the stool, which was apparently intended to be read. He cast his eyes over it and saw details of the execution and the last moments of Louis General, executed at Besançon. The paper was torn. The 2 first words of a line were legible on the back. They were, "The first step." "Who could have put this paper there?" said Julien. "Poor fellow," he added with a sigh, "the last syllable of his name is the same as mine," and he crumpled up the paper. As he left, Julien thought he saw blood near the host. It was holy water which the priests had been sprinkling on it. The reflection of the red curtains which covered the windows made it look like blood. Finally, Julien felt ashamed of his secret terror. "Am I going to play the coward?" he said to himself. "To arms." This phrase, repeated so often in the old Surgeon Major's battle stories, symbolized heroism to Julien. He got up rapidly and walked to de Renal's house. As soon as he saw it 20 yards in front of him, he was seized, in spite of his fine resolution, with an overwhelming timidity. The iron grille was open. He thought it was magnificent. He had to go inside. Julien was not the only person whose heart was troubled by his arrival in the house. The extreme timidity of Madame de Renal was fluttered when she thought of this stranger whose functions would necessitate his coming between her and her children. She was accustomed to seeing her sons sleep in her own room. She had shed many tears that morning when she had seen their beds carried into the apartment intended for the tutor. It was in vain that she asked her husband to have the bed of Stanislas Xavier, the youngest, carried back into her room. Womanly delicacy was carried in Madame de Renal to the point of excess. She conjured up in her imagination the most disagreeable personage, who was coarse, badly groomed, and charged with the duty of scolding her children simply because he happened to know Latin, and only too ready to flog her sons for their ignorance of that barbarous language.